Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. As I mentioned yesterday, your income taxes aren't due for another 90 days. That's filing the form and writing the check if you have to. So that's the best news I can offer you to lead off the podcast today, because while we are distracted by pandemic response here on planet Earth, there are dire new reports about how the planet is warming, species are becoming extinct, and important glaciers and ice flows are melting. So the first report relates to species. And a study that is published this month in Nature predicted that large swaths of ecosystems will falter in waves, creating sudden die-offs that would be catastrophic, not only for wildlife, but for the humans who depend on it. And that's a real sweet way of greasing the skids to let you know that human extinction will inevitably follow mass extinction of species. So the study looked at more than 30,000 species on land and water to predict how soon climate change would affect population levels and whether those levels would change gradually or suddenly. The authors determined the hottest temperature that a species is known to have withstood and then predicted when that temperature would be surpassed around the world under different emissions scenarios. And Alex Piggott, a scientist at the University College London and one of the study's authors, for a long time things can seem okay and then suddenly they're not. Then it's too late to do anything about it because you've already fallen over this cliff edge. And we're already losing to extinction an alarming number of species on an almost daily basis. Now, in a separate report that examined the melting of Greenland's ice sheet in the summer of 2019, that's just last year, researchers have confirmed in a study that reveals the loss was largely down to a persistent zone of high pressure over the region. The ice sheet melted at a near record rate in 2019, and much faster than the average of previous decades. Figures have suggested that last July alone, surface ice declined by 197 gigatons, equivalent to about 80 million Olympic swimming pools, if you can imagine that. Now experts have examined the level of melting in more detail, revealing what drove it, and critically, the high-pressure atmospheric conditions lasted for two-thirds, 63 of the 92 summer days in 2019, compared with an average of just 28 days between 1981 and 2010. So this kind of acceleration is very concerning. It is a clear message. And many of you may have listened to my interview that was released at the end of April last year with the controversial climate scientist Guy McPherson. And he has said that humans not may, but he predicts we will be extinct by 2030. And this alarmed many people. A couple of listeners said that they lost sleep over it, and they wanted a lifeboat to cling to. Peter, tell me this can't be true. Well, I'm just the messenger here, or the facilitator. And Guy McPherson has been studying climate science since the 1980s. And I have linked to both the audio podcast and the video interview I did with Guy McPherson on Marin TV. And I invite you to watch or listen as you choose. Now, we know that Senator Bernie Sanders has sucked it up and endorsed Joe Biden for president. Bernie Sanders was the loudest proponent, maybe next to Tom Steyer, who kind of shifted his presidential campaign away from the single subject of climate change And if you have a memory, you'll recall that in the early stages of the Democratic debates, there was a guy named Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, who was also running a single-issue candidacy focused around climate change. But as the campaign went on, it was Bernie Sanders who was the one who was willing to stick his neck out and support the Green New Deal. The other real progressive in the race, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, she famously said, well, I have a plan for that. And she did. And it wasn't as comprehensive or expensive as the Green New Deal, but she made a serious effort to address a serious problem. And so today, Senator Warren did what she had to do. She endorsed Joe Biden for President of the United States. And this was bound to happen, so it's hardly news or surprising. But when we frame it around the climate emergency that we face, well, Joe Biden soft pedals. He tips his hat and says, yeah, we got a problem. But he is such a middle-of-the-road product of the United States Senate where compromise is always a way of life. Despite the words that smoothly came out of Barack Obama's mouth yesterday in endorsing his buddy Joe, where Obama talked about the need for bold ideas, you're not going to get any bold ideas about climate from Joe Biden. And because of the money that's been borrowed in trillions of dollars to address the corporate impact, primarily, of the pandemic, if a Democrat, and Joe Biden is the only one who currently fits that description, manages to beat Trump in November, or Trump manages to lose to Joe Biden, depending on the composition of the Senate, it's likely that Republicans will return to their deep concerns about the annual deficit. This year it's going to be $3 trillion. And the long-term government debt, and I've lost track, it's somewhere around 25, 26 trillion now. It is a huge percentage of our gross domestic product. And they're going to become deficit hawks again. They've already opened up every channel to pull carbon out of the ground and burn it into the air. And there is no indication the Democrats will be able to change that curve without dramatic action. So when you hear Elizabeth Warren read a speech in this moment of crisis, it's more important than ever that the next president restores Americans' faith in good, effective government. Joe Biden has spent nearly his entire life in public service. He knows that a government run with integrity, competence, and heart will save lives and save livelihoods, and we can't afford to let Donald Trump continue to endanger the lives and livelihoods of every American. And get this, to her credit, Warren was openly hostile and aggressive in her debate commentary about Joe Biden in particular on the bankruptcy law that he wrote and then forgot he wrote it. Yet she managed to say, one thing I appreciate about Joe Biden is that he will always tell you where he stands. When you disagree, he'll listen, not just listen, but really hear you and treat you with respect, no matter where you're coming from. And he's shown throughout this campaign that when you come up with new facts or a good argument, he's not too afraid or too proud to be persuaded. Well, what he does is he nods in the direction of big change. And Bernie Sanders had an opportunity to win dramatic concessions on policy matters from Joe Biden before he dropped out and endorsed him. And while he got Biden to agree that he would support lowering the age of qualification for Medicare from 65 to 60, and he's made a nod toward student debt issues. Oh, and I think he now thinks that a $15 minimum wage is not a bad idea. But Bernie didn't get Joe Biden to move on climate change, to recognize the gravity of the problem and the depth of response that is required. And now, in an ill-timed kind of threat to Bernie supporters to fall in line, Senator Sanders has warned that it would be irresponsible for his loyalists not to support Biden, warning that progressives who sit on their hands in the months ahead would simply enable Donald Trump's re-election in November. And he acknowledges that he has policy differences with Biden, but we're supposed to adopt his amnesiac position and just fall in line like sheep and chickens. Say, just like we did in 2004, that John Kerry wasn't that great, but hey, he wasn't George W. Bush. In 2016, Hillary Clinton's got a lot of problems, many self-inflicted, but hey, Donald Trump. And these types of leverage don't work. And it is ridiculous to try to use them at this point, when the wounds are fresh, when the Bernie supporters, you can even call them Bernie bros, I don't care. But they feel angry, bitter, betrayed. And when you try to sit on them now and say, well, get on board the Biden bandwagon, none of what happened in the last 2 years matters. And so I do understand politics. I've worked on major campaigns, including a U.S. Senate race. And yeah, you know, people generally fall in line. And when you go to the polls in November, you got 2 names on the ballot, and you make that lesser evil choice. But for anyone, including Bernie, to imagine that he can lecture his supporters at this point and that the diehards are not going to resist, it's just, it's bad politics. Today, I received in my email a dispatch from David Sirota. He's a talented writer. He's a good progressive. He hosted a radio show in Denver for several years. His wife is a member of the lower house of the legislature in Colorado. And he was recruited to the Sanders campaign as a speechwriter and an advisor. And he has a newsletter out called TMI, Too Much Information. You can find it over at Substack, and I want to thank Jason Spitzer. He sent me the link. I've included it in the show file for this podcast. And Sirota doesn't go deep or air any real dirty laundry, but he does admit that some of the postmortems that have been written recently have what he calls nuggets of truth, but also some fiction. And so he writes, yes, it is true. A small group of us with many years of campaign experience pushed Bernie to sharply contrast his own progressive record with Biden's record of working with Republicans against the Democratic agenda. And Sirota says, I've been on 7 underdog challenger campaigns in my life and won a few of them. And campaign 101 is you contrast or you lose. And the way I've put it is that, you know, Bernie came into a sword fight with a butter knife. And you don't have to stab your opponent in the back or even in the front. But you got to slice off a little something. Maybe a pinky, maybe just a fingernail. I think you get my point. And I'm trying to add to Sirota's point here that the biggest failure of Bernie was that he was too polite, that he thought his vision and his lofty ideas, the revolution that he talked about, would carry the day. But in the end, politics is a dirty business, and if you're not willing to get dirty, you're not going to win, especially when there were 24 people on the debate stage way back there. And that Biden had the advantage of being a former vice president, tight with the corporate wing and the leadership of the Democratic National Committee. And just a quick thumbnail here, Sirota writes, Bernie was fighting to stop the Iraq War. Biden helped the GOP pass the resolution and vote down Democratic amendments. When Bernie was fighting to stop the bankruptcy bill, Biden helped pass the legislation with Republicans that could now crush hundreds of thousands of Americans during the forthcoming recession, which I think is going to be technically a depression. While Bernie and Paul Wellstone were pushing a bill to lower the price of prescription drugs and prevent profiteering off vaccines developed at taxpayer expense, Biden was helping Republicans kill the initiative. And then there were the repeated efforts that Biden joined in on to cut Social Security. Continuing from Sirota here, even though Biden at times pathologically lied about some of these facts, at one point insisting he didn't help write his own bankruptcy bill, the record is verifiable, not in dispute. A group of us on the campaign believed it was important for this record to be spotlighted. We didn't push Bernie to attack Biden in some sort of vicious way. We pushed him to simply and very explicitly cast the primary as a choice between a vision of progressive change and Biden's promise to his donors that nothing will fundamentally change. And to his credit, Sirota continues, Bernie at times worked with us and embraced the strategy, and when he did, it was successful, like his Social Security contrast with Biden in Iowa and his contrast with Wine Cave Pete in New Hampshire. I actually thought that was pretty weak. Pete's not a billionaire. He took some money from a handful of billionaires, but I thought that was a trivial matter. Anyway, back to Sirota. Ultimately, Biden was able to avoid having to constantly try to explain his offensive record. He was allowed to depict himself as a safe, electable unity candidate. Sirota goes on, I'm confident that a stronger contrast would have at least put us in a better position to survive when Beto, Klobuchar, Pete all fell in line behind Biden to help him seal Super Tuesday. And here's the part where I think that Sirota goes a little soft, because he says, well, according to exit polls, Biden was able to win the largest share of Democratic voters in 15 states who all said health care was their top priority. But he doesn't note that those same exit polls indicated chicanery in the vote counts. The gaming in Iowa, the strong indications of wide disparities between the exit poll counts and the official tallies in many states, including Massachusetts, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Not that Bernie was going to win South Carolina, but the margin for Biden appeared to be pumped up. So I think Sirota's critique is worth reading. He talks about this whole idea, a tyranny of decorum, and that Bernie's captive to that. He never wanted to be a negative campaigner or perceived that way, and the rest of the candidates pushed that button. And it had the desired effect. Bernie was just too polite. There's more in it, and I encourage you to read it as we move on to other news today. Here in California, Governor Newsom is ignoring Trump's claim of absolute power over whatever it means to reopen our economies and our lives. And Newsom, let me just point out that recently Trump was asked what his criteria are for so-called reopening America. And Trump pointed to his noggin, and he said the criteria are right in here. And the stable genius doesn't offer any details about that. And later we'll get to the corporatists who he has put on a panel to advise him on when and how to do this, and we know he'll ignore that anyway. So Newsom has listed 6 points. He spelled out these criteria that must be met before the state's stay-at-home order is modified or lifted. Widespread testing that would allow the state to isolate people exposed to the virus and trace people with whom they come into contact. And he's not talking about some of the tech surveillance or the identity card that some people have described that would serve that aim. Number 2, the ability for the state to care for older and medically vulnerable Californians. 3, the capacity for hospitals to handle a potential surge in patients and resume normal preventive and other medical care, the identification of promising treatments, the development of guidelines for businesses and schools to allow physical distancing even as they reopen, and 6, the creation of a data tracking system that provides an early warning if the state needs to reinstate a stay-at-home order. Now, he talked about, for example, in restaurants, where the tables will be more widely spaced, where the wait staff will wear gloves and masks, where you'll be issued a menu and you take it with you. It's a disposable menu. And that your temperature might be checked before you enter a public place or a workplace. And I consider those to be reasonable accommodations to the need to protect people without negatively violating our privacy rights. So there's speculation, this isn't coming from Newsom, that the restrictions, the stay-at-home order, may be lifted in mid-May. Here in my area, Marin County, the local officials say that it's probably mid-May when restrictions will shift if the current trends continue. And I want to make a quick point here because there are a lot of people, we'll get to it in a bit, who are agitating, and are all kinds of wild claims that are out there that, this is practice for the next round of public, what's the right word, submission to government authority. And the order to stay in place, to shelter in place, to stay at home, here in California, did not originate at the state level. Now, Newsom was considering it, but it was the county health officials in originally 6 counties around San Francisco, including mine, who originally made the call that people had to shelter in place. Then Newsom expanded it, and notably, Governor Cuomo did not. He kind of vacillated, talked about, 50% of the people can work and 50% of the people will stay home. And it was during that critical period. And I do believe that the new information that the infections in New York did not originate from China, but were brought in from Europe, notably Italy. And I believe that, New York had a more serious problem. But Los Angeles has, 6 million people? New York, the official population is 8. And there are under 400 deaths in Los Angeles. And the number in New York, we'll get to it, but it is north of 6,000 or 6,500, I believe. So as I got ready to record today's podcast, a little flash came over from the San Francisco Chronicle that Governor Newsom has announced economic relief for undocumented residents of California. I don't have more detail on that, but it is a welcome need. These are the people who are suffering the most, and we have a large undocumented, Trump would call them illegal aliens, here in California. So here are the stats in New York. The plateau remains the same on fatalities. It was 752 announced yesterday, and the day before it was 778. And Cuomo has issued a statewide order for people to wear masks in places where social distancing cannot be maintained, and critically, he's saying on the subways. And I think that is a very crucial move. They also at the state and local level, we're seeing the order to wear face coverings of some sort. And as I've said, I don't think that this is a fix, but I think it does reduce transmission when I cough. And that is at least a step in the right direction. Couple of other quick headlines here. Clinicians around the world are seeing evidence that the coronavirus isn't just destroying lungs. It may be causing heart inflammation, acute kidney disease, neurological malfunction, blood clots, intestinal damage, and liver problems as well. So here is our daily coronavirus update, edited by Linda Lewis, with my gratitude. Worldwide, the number of identified cases is over 2 million. 130,500 have died. The U.S. has 613 confirmed cases, 27,000 deaths. And these figures run a little bit behind. And as we'll note, that there was an increase, kind of jump in the total fatalities for New York State because they felt they were underreporting deaths that occurred at home. So Trump has moved to halt funding to the World Health Organization, and this is just another blame shift on his part. Now, I don't say that the World Health Organization is faultless, but Trump is trying to find somebody else to blame for his own failings. And the U.S. contribution is about 15% of the World Health Organization's annual budget, $400 million. And Trump is giving us a kind of whiplash because after his extraordinary claims of presidential power to order governors to reopen their states, he then said on Tuesday, we don't want to put pressure on anybody. I'm not going to put any pressure on any governor to open. He said he would be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening and a very powerful reopening plan of their state at a time and manner as most appropriate. Can never believe anything that guy says, especially when he is in full bully mode. And as we covered yesterday, he first blames the governors for inaction, not being prepared enough, and relying on the federal government, and then he hammers them for the very same issues in reverse. So there's a lot of chatter, particularly from Republicans, who say, you know, the numbers aren't that big, we overreacted, and of course they ignore that the numbers would have been much bigger if we hadn't acted or overreacted, which is their claim. And Linda presents a parade of Republicans, Ron Johnson parroting the White House talking point, got to make sure the cure isn't worse than the disease. Andy Biggs of Arizona, chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, is one of the most vocal GOP lawmakers. And, he's probably standing in for the new White House chief of staff, whose name is I'm blanking on right now, but who used to lead the Freedom Caucus. Also, Pat Toomey, Senator of Pennsylvania, we're extremely unlikely to overwhelm our hospital capacities, so let's just let some more people die. John Cornyn, Senator of Texas. Oh, I'm a big fan of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. I think they've done a great job, but their job is just public health. And so the effort to rationalize the risk that if we expand activity too soon, that this virus, which is highly contagious, very different from the average annual flu, where they say, well, 600,000 people die. But Linda points out that they are comparing, typically, the rate of death for a 2-week period with numbers that relate to annual deaths from various types of flu. And so it's not apples and apples, but they don't care. And she quotes Paul Krugman. I've seen people portray it as a conflict between epidemiologists and economists, but that's all wrong. A survey of economists found almost unanimous support for tolerating a very large contraction in economic activity until the spread of infections has dropped significantly. No, says Krugman, this push to reopen is coming not from economists, but from cranks and cronies. That's it. That is, it's coming on one side from people who may describe themselves as economists, but whom the professionals consider cranks, like Peter Navarro or Stephen Moore, who Trump tried unsuccessfully to appoint to the Federal Reserve. And, on the other, It's coming from business types with close ties to Trump who suffer from billionaire's disease, the tendency to assume that just because you're rich, you're also smarter than anyone else. Those are pretty good comments. And Linda also cites a number of sorts of misinformation. And she sent me a separate report yesterday that deals with that, but she cites Politico's reporting today that identifies a guy whose nickname is Dr. Shiva, and his full name is Ayadara Shiva Ayadurai. That is, a Mumbai-born and U.S.-raised entrepreneur with that Ph.D. from MIT. And he's getting a lot of clicks and watches on Facebook and YouTube. And he is, very much pushing the talking points of the Trump administration. Linda's separate report that she sent me late yesterday opens, I've been seeing a huge amount of social media promoting misinformation about coronavirus blatantly incorrect. Attacks on Fauci and Birx have the same intent, which is provoking others to reject public health directives. She says, I think the pandemic has sparked a good deal of hysteria that festers when people have nothing to do. But some appear to be organized efforts, mainly right-wing, to distract attention from oligarch-created systemic problems that the coronavirus is exposing. A crumbling public health system, lack of universal health care, indebted underpaid workers, corporations that prop up their stock prices rather than prepare for disasters, and so on. And she says, I think the oligarchs, particularly those on the right, are afraid that the longer workers remain unemployed, the more likely they are to demand more concessions on income, health care, and related issues. So in Ohio, there are about 100 protesters who went to the State House, and this was, I think, on Monday, as Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, gave his daily briefing. And, led by State Senator Andrew Brenner, a Republican, he said, we need to get the economy open, even if that means social distancing of some sort for months to come. We can't stay like this much longer, and the hundreds of thousands of Ohioans who've lost their jobs or the thousands of small business owners can't keep doing this either. And yesterday I talked about how Justin Amash, former Republican, now an independent who's teasing a run for president under the Libertarian banner, well, he's part of the cabal in Michigan. They're attacking Governor Gretchen Whitmer to do, just to reopen and let people make up their own minds. Now, as you know, I lost a cousin. It's Kathy's cousin, actually, who died a couple of weeks ago from the coronavirus in Detroit. And I have to be a little careful here due to family dynamics, but I can tell you that many people in Michigan cling to Trump despite very personal losses. And they don't blame him. They blame Whitmer because she's a Democrat. And there's a lot of Fox News indoctrination. And the formerly Democratic stronghold of Michigan has a lot of people who have grown much more comfortable under Trump, and they don't challenge the thinking that is indoctrinated into their brains. So we have Justin Amash, and today the protesters went to Lansing, the scene of the state capitol in Michigan. They launched Operation Gridlock. And guess who paid for it? The Michigan Freedom Fund, linked to the DeVos family. Betsy spent large to buy the post of Secretary of Education. Their money comes from the Amway direct marketing fortune. And they joined up with the Michigan Conservative Coalition. And they're protesting in Lansing. Citizens are tired, frankly, of being treated like babies. As adults, we now know what needs to be done to stay safe. But per capita, Michigan, I believe, is number 2 to New York in both infections and deaths from COVID-19. And Justin Amash wants to ride that wave? Well, I yesterday mused a little bit about how he might be a useful tool to cast a protest vote against Trump, because it would likely draw from Trump and not from a Democrat. But I can't advance that idea. And as I've said, Amash has been good on some issues like surveillance and war powers. But by and large, he is a movement conservative, and that's not going to change. And Linda referred to the misinformation, the disinformation, and the, non-factual claims that are out there. You can call them lies. And over at Snopes, which is not perfect, I've challenged them on certain calls, but Snopes is an independent organization that tries to debunk things that are not true and confirm things that they find to be true. And they are overwhelmed. It's been described as an infodemic, which makes it hard for people to find trusty sources and reliable guidance when they need it, and I would add when they need it most. But Snopes is fighting just this huge wave. It's got a small staff. They've had a 43% increase in requests, and many of them appear pretty silly to me. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has laid out the first steps for lifting the restrictions in Germany, and Iran, desperate due to U.S. sanctions before being hit hard by COVID-19, they have moved to reopen their economy. A huge portion of the workforce is employed by the government. They're all back at work. All the transit systems are up and running. And it looks like about a third of the population is still hunkered down to some extent. But my impression, and there's a good story at the Washington Post about this, written by Jason Rezaian, the guy who spent a couple of years locked up in prison in Iran, that they feel they don't have any other choice because we have so cruelly brought them to their knees. A couple of noteworthy comments from Speaker Pelosi. She called Trump's decision to suspend funding to the World Health Organization illegal and vowed that it will be swiftly challenged. Quote, the president's halting of funding to the WHO as it leads the global fight against the coronavirus is senseless. This is another case of the president's ineffective response that a weak person, a poor leader, takes no responsibility. A weak person blames others. This decision is dangerous, illegal, and will be swiftly challenged, although she doesn't exactly say how. And she also tweaked Trump for insisting that his signature has to be included on checks of the money that the government is using to stimulate the economy by putting it in the hands of people with incomes under $75,000. Delaying direct payments to vulnerable families just to print his name on the check is another shameful example of Trump's catastrophic failure to treat the crisis with the urgency it demands. There are a couple of stories today about the data related to coronavirus infections and death counts. So ProPublica has a story published yesterday, quoting here, coronavirus death counts are based on positive tests and driven by hospital deaths, but data from major metropolitan areas show a spike of in-home deaths or at-home deaths, prompting one expert to say current numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. The Guardian reports that here in the United States, the coronavirus is killing far more American health care workers than the official data suggest. The official number is just under 10,000. Officials here say they have no actual way to count. That's kind of a dodge. But that CDC officials who are closely tracking the occupations of people with the virus say that the infections, these are not deaths, that healthcare workers account for about 11,000. And in today's San Francisco Chronicle, a new study estimates that as many 270,000 Californians are infected with the coronavirus, which is 10 times the number that has previously been reported. It's a 61-page report from epidemiologists at UC Davis. And It says that an estimated 86% of all infections are undocumented. The death rate is estimated at 0.8%, which is about 8 times worse than the flu. But, of course, we hear Rush Limbaugh, and he was at it again this morning, seeking to minimize the whole thing. He's modified his tune a little bit. He said, yeah, it's here and it kills people, but, you know, then he shifts his tone just to say that the numbers do not justify the response. Also in the Chronicle, and I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, there's a great review of the history of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And I've shared with you my misgivings about his past. And those go back to the early 80s when he was a government official during the Reagan administration. And Ronald Reagan would never utter the word AIDS until his buddy Rock Hudson died. And then he felt he had to acknowledge that it was real. And so Fauci tangled with the president at that point and kept his job. He's trying to do the same under Trump. But going back to the early 80s, Fauci was blamed for outdated drug testing and distribution systems that initially he did little to change. And then he did evolve, partly through contact with some of the most aggressive AIDS activists, like the people from ACT UP. You remember that? And it quotes one of those ACT UP leaders, Mark Harrington. When the history of AIDS in 1989 is written, the transformation of Anthony Fauci may well emerge as one of the most dramatic and consequential of human interest stories. So check it out. It adds depth to the evolution of Dr. Fauci. As you know, I've been diverting money that comes in from my subscribers. I've pledged $1,200, and I'm not sure I'm going to get that government check. It'll only happen if they don't look at my tax returns and they look at the fact that I get a little Social Security money. So I'm not counting on that, but I have spotted $1,200, and I am diverting the subscription funds for the next 60 days to the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund. And today I am granting a $100 grant, and I wish, I had thousands to give, to Blake in Madison, Wisconsin. He writes, I listen to your podcast every day, have for many years. This is a pretty shitty time to be an American. Technically, I'm homeless, but I'm lucky enough to be quarantining with my girlfriend, who's on unemployment from her job at the university in her little one-bed apartment. My last real job was playing organ for the Madison Mallards baseball team, $55 a game. And when a batter, he goes into one of his complaints about the job. So he has 53 cents in the credit union, $4 in his wallet, some change in the old Subaru with the muffler falling off. He said, $100, I could keep my flip phone on for 30 more days, put some gas in the car. So he is asking for a check. And Blake, you get a check for $100. I'll put it in the mail today, and I might slip a 20 or two from my own wallet in to help you out a little bit more. And this is all funded by, I mentioned my contribution, but listeners like Benny Alto in Coos Bay, he chipped in an extra $25. He's a regular subscriber here. At one point, he had one for each of his dogs. And I also want to thank regular contributors Doug Cooper, David Radcliffe, Elizabeth Vasquez, and Diane Morris in Maine just renewed an annual subscription. Thank you all. So once again, if you have this kind of need, email Peter at peterbcollins.com. You don't have to be in the United States, and we will be very generous in our criteria. If you indicate a need, we are going to respond in any way we can. And also, if you want to top off the grant that we're distributing to Blake today, feel free to do so. Just send me an email. I want to give $50, and I'd like it to go to Blake. We'll do our best to manage that, but it's just me here, so understand and give me a little slack on the management of the fund drive here. Now, Blake isn't the only one who has needs. There is an organization here in the United States owned by a billionaire, a highly leveraged guy who has a track record of leveraging to the hilt. He once told us he was the king of debt. And the Trump boys who are running the Trump organization have asked the only bank that will lend them money, Deutsche Bank, to allow them to delay paying some loans because their golf courses are closed, their hotels are shut down, their effort to sell high, the Washington hotel that is leased from the federal government, was the original basis of claims under the Emoluments Act, or the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. And so these poor boys are losing $1 million a day in revenue because their hotel in Las Vegas had to be shut down, the golf clubs can't be open. Don't you feel sorry for them? Over at Midpress News today, Alan McLeod lists some of the corporate interests that are benefiting from this crisis. United Healthcare, the country's largest insurer, is predicted to announce yearly profits of over $21 billion later today. That, according to Wendell Potter, the Madison, Wisconsin-based whistleblower who used to work in the insurance industry. Not only that, United Healthcare has been strong-arming its doctors into accepting pay cuts of up to 60%. And Potter says patients are getting crushed financially because of United Health's actions, and some doctors may as well. Other people benefiting, Jeff Bezos has seen his fortune swell by more than $24 billion. The founder of Zoom, Eric Yuan, he's richer, doubling his fortune to $7.4 billion in just the recent weeks. And while Disneyland is shut and the movie production is stalled, Disney's stock price is rallying from $85 in March to $106 today, a 20% increase because of the $250 billion bailout of the hotel and entertainment industry. USA Today suggests that large airlines are the big winners from Trump's bailout package. Since April 3rd, American Airlines shares have gone up 27%. Yes, the rich get richer. It always works out that way. And meanwhile, the small business interests that responded to a call to apply for loans for bailouts that could be, in some cases, forgiven. Well, some people applied to the Small Business Administration. In fact, they are swamped with more than 3 million applications that amount to requests for billions and billions. I'm turning the page here, and it's stuck. Here are the numbers. The 3 million applications request $372 billion, and there's only $7 billion in the SBA account for disaster loans. And the Republicans who've asked for $250 billion, that's for another program. It doesn't even address this window that desperate people have been sent to try to borrow in order to keep their businesses operating. More details on the latest red ink at the Postal Service, which Republicans have been trying to build up to just drown the damn thing since Bush was in office back in 2005. And it was complicity of Democrats and Republicans who either hate the post office and want to give that business to Amazon and UPS and FedEx, or Democrats who think that it's passé and needs to be reformed. At any rate, the bottom line is that the Postal Service has fake debt because that law back in 2006 requires it to put away money to pay the pensions of postal workers before they even retire. And it's a voodoo economics game that has rolled up a total of $160 billion in debt, and $120 billion of that is related to the scheme about retiree benefits. It's a scam, and we're going to watch the post office go down. A lot of people are buying extra stamps right now to try to bail them out, and I don't oppose that, but I doubt if it will have the desired effect. So here are the corporate leaders who Trump has tapped, some of whom didn't even know that they were going to be invited to be on the Open the Country Council. But Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan Chase, Stephen Schwartzman, Blackstone, and by the way, I think I've overstated his role at BlackRock, but I think he was or is on the board of directors over there. Tim Cook from Apple, Trump calls him Tim Apple. Mark Zuckerberg. Now, I'm sorry. Zuck has done a phenomenal job, made a boatload of money at Facebook. But what does he know about reopening the economy? Then there's Bob Kraft, the guy who got caught getting hand jobs or something like that, a happy ending massage at the Parlor in South Florida. He's also the owner of the New England Patriots. Trump wants them to devise a scheme to restart professional sports. And I think it's going to happen without fans, at least for a while. So this is also kind of meaningless. The only surprise is that he invited Jeff Bezos, his archenemy who owns the Washington Post and Amazon, to serve on this council. And the bottom line is that they'll have some meetings, probably by Zoom, and Trump will ignore their advice. The New York Times is reporting from inside sources at the White House that in March, Trump waltzed into the Situation Room, and he didn't want to talk about the virus or, what he should be doing. His idea was he wanted to start a 2-hour-a-day radio show. Now, as somebody who's hosted syndicated radio shows, I can tell you it's fun, it's fascinating, it's unpredictable, you never know who's going to call. But almost as soon as he proposed the idea, he scuttled it because he didn't want to compete with Rush Limbaugh, his faithful toady and promoter of the daily talking points of the Trump regime. And finally today, I want to recommend you drop by Shadowproof, where Kevin Gostola has posted the second podcast installment of his interview series with my buddy Brad Schreiber, who we have an interview with him in our archives here from earlier this year. But Brad's latest book, his Music is Power, and Kevin focuses on some of the activist music. In this episode, it's Jimi Hendrix and Pink Floyd, so you can check that out if you're looking for some extra interesting entertainment. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.